I spent 11 days sobbing over ransom notes, calling detectives twice a day, terrified my husband was being held in some basement, tortured by people who wanted money I didn't have. On the 12th day, while I was sitting in our living room with 2 FBI agents, preparing myself to hear that they'd found a body, my husband was drinking coffee on a balcony overlooking the Mediterranean, 4,000 miles away, using a name that wasn't his own. My name is Camille. I'm 39 years old, and this is the story of how my husband, Thomas, staged his own kidnapping, a struggle in our garage, a ransom note, blood that turned out to be his own, deliberately drawn, to disappear from an embezzlement investigation that was 3 weeks from destroying him, and to start an entirely new life, under a new name, with a woman I'd never heard of, in a country he'd apparently been quietly visiting for over a year. I want to tell you exactly how I found out none of it was real, what a forensic accountant discovered buried in years of falsified company records, and the exact moment federal investigators realized the man they'd been searching for as a kidnapping victim was actually the person they should have been building a fraud case against all along. I need to walk you through that first morning in careful detail, because the specific, staged nature of what I initially believed to be a genuine crime scene matters enormously to understanding everything that followed. Thomas and I had been married for 14 years, building what I genuinely believed was a stable, comfortable life. He ran a mid-sized commercial construction firm he'd inherited from his own father, a business that had, by every visible sign, continued the same steady, respectable success it had maintained for decades. I worked as a high school guidance counselor, our 2 teenagers were thriving, and our marriage, while not without ordinary friction, felt, right up until that specific morning, entirely solid. I woke that morning to find Thomas's car still in the garage, his phone on the kitchen counter, and the garage door standing open, a small pool of blood near his car's driver's side door, his keys scattered several feet away as though dropped during some kind of struggle. I found a folded note on the kitchen table roughly 20 minutes later, typed rather than handwritten, informing me that Thomas had been taken, that any attempt to contact police would result in immediate, serious consequences, and that further instructions regarding a ransom demand would follow within 48 hours. I called the police within minutes, despite the note's explicit warning, understanding instinctively that professional guidance mattered more than blind compliance with instructions from people I had no reason to trust. What followed was 11 days I still find difficult to fully describe. FBI involvement given the apparent kidnapping and interstate ransom demand, a command center effectively established in my own home, family and friends rotating through to support me, all while I genuinely, completely believed my husband's life was in immediate, mortal danger. I remember, specifically, the physical sensation of those first few hours, a kind of shaking, disconnected numbness, my hands unable to hold a coffee cup steady, my mind cycling through every possible scenario of what might be happening to Thomas in that exact moment. I called his parents, his siblings, our closest friends, each call requiring me to say words I still find difficult to fully process having actually spoken aloud. My husband has been kidnapped. Our home, over the following hours, filled with people who loved us both, creating a strange, terrible vigil that would ultimately stretch across 11 full days that I want to spend a moment describing who Thomas had been to me across our 14 years together, because understanding the specific, sustained trust one placed in him matters for understanding how completely this deception blindsided me. Thomas had inherited his father's construction company roughly 8 years into our marriage, taking on a business that had, by every visible sign I had access to, continued its steady, respectable success under his leadership. He was, by most external appearances, a genuinely devoted father, coaching our son's baseball team for years, never missing our daughter's dance recitals despite what I understood to be a demanding, travel-heavy work schedule. I mention these specific details because I think it's important to understand that nothing about the man I knew for 14 years prepared me for the specific, calculated capacity for deception I would eventually discover he possessed. I want to describe several specific details from those 11 days that, in hindsight, should have raised more immediate suspicion than they did at the time, though I want to be honest that grief and terror considerably impair the kind of careful, analytical thinking that might have caught these inconsistencies sooner. The ransom demand itself, when it arrived roughly 48 hours after Thomas's apparent disappearance, requested an amount that struck the investigating FBI agents as somewhat unusual, considerably lower than typical ransom demands for someone of Thomas's apparent financial profile, a detail one of the lead agents, a careful, experienced investigator named Agent Reyes, mentioned to me directly as slightly atypical, though not definitively suspicious on its own. I remember reading that ransom note for the first time, my hands shaking so badly Agent Reyes had to help steady the paper, my mind unable to focus on anything beyond the specific demand for money and the implicit threat underlying every carefully typed word. I didn't have any capacity, in that moment, to notice or question the specific amount requested, focused entirely on the practical, urgent question of how quickly I could actually gather those funds, a question that would, I now understand, never have actually mattered at all, since no genuine kidnappers existed to ever collect any payment regardless of how quickly I might have assembled it. I also remember, though I didn't fully register its significance until much later, a specific detail regarding the blood found at the scene. Forensic technicians had confirmed it was, in fact, Thomas's own blood, a detail that had, at the time, only deepened my terror, confirming that whatever violence had occurred in our garage that morning had genuinely involved my husband directly. I understand now, with the benefit of everything I eventually learned, that this same detail, confirmed blood but relatively modest in actual volume, was also consistent with a self-inflicted, carefully controlled wound rather than genuine violent injury, a distinction forensic analysis hadn't yet fully explored during those initial, frantic days. I remember Agent Reyes explaining to me, much later, once the full truth had emerged, exactly how carefully Thomas had apparently staged that entire scene. He'd used a small, controlled cut to his own hand, sufficient to produce a convincing quantity of blood without any genuine risk to himself, and had deliberately scattered his keys and disturbed several items in the garage to suggest a struggle, all of it executed, according to the evidence investigators eventually pieced together, with a specific, methodical calm that Agent Reyes described as considerably more premeditated than the panicked, spontaneous act of a man simply trying to escape a bad situation. Roughly a week into the investigation, I want to describe a specific shift I noticed in how Agent Reyes and her team approached their questions, a shift that felt, at the time, disorienting and almost hurtful, though I understand now it reflected the careful, professional instincts of experienced investigators beginning to notice inconsistencies I hadn't yet consciously registered myself. Agent Reyes began asking increasingly detailed questions about Thomas's business finances, his recent travel history, and whether I'd noticed any unusual behavior in the weeks or months before his disappearance. I remember feeling genuinely confused, even mildly offended, by the specific direction of these questions, unable to understand why investigators searching for my kidnapped husband would need such detailed information about his business's financial records rather than focusing entirely on tracking down whoever had apparently taken him. I learned, considerably later, that this shift in questioning reflected the FBI's own parallel financial investigation, one that had begun independently once federal financial crimes investigators, alerted by unusual activity patterns in Thomas's company accounts, had started examining his business's finances even before his apparent kidnapping, a coincidence of timing that would eventually prove central to understanding everything that had actually happened. I remember one specific afternoon, roughly 8 days into the ordeal, when Agent Reyes asked me directly whether Thomas had seemed unusually stressed or preoccupied in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, a question I answered honestly at the time, describing what I genuinely believed was simply ordinary work pressure related to a demanding new construction contract. I told her about several late nights he'd spent in his home office, door closed, working on what he described as complicated project bids. I understand now that those same late nights almost certainly involved considerably different work entirely, finalizing the offshore transfers and new identity documentation that would eventually allow him to disappear so completely that I want to describe what Agent Reyes eventually shared with me, once her team's parallel financial investigation began revealing findings that reframed the entire case, because understanding the actual financial context matters enormously to understanding why Thomas ultimately did what he did. A forensic accountant working with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division had, in the weeks immediately preceding Thomas's disappearance, identified a substantial, sustained pattern of embezzlement from Thomas's own construction company, funds diverted over nearly 4 years through a series of fraudulent vendor invoices and shell companies, totaling several $1 million that Thomas had systematically siphoned away from his own family business. I learned that this investigation had actually begun independently, triggered by a routine audit request from the company's own board of directors, several of whom were extended family members who'd grown concerned about the business's declining profitability despite what appeared to be steady, healthy revenue. That audit, scheduled to formally begin roughly 3 weeks after Thomas's disappearance, would very likely have exposed the entire scheme. A timeline agent Reyes explained struck her team as considerably too convenient to represent genuine coincidence once they understood it clearly. I remember, once I understood this timeline clearly, calling Thomas's cousin Daniel, one of the board members who'd initially requested the audit, a conversation that added its own painful layer to everything I was processing. Daniel told me he'd grown concerned nearly a year earlier, noticing specific inconsistencies between the company's reported project margins and what he understood, from his own experience in the construction industry, to be realistic figures for the type and scale of projects Thomas's company had been handling. He said he'd raised these concerns with Thomas directly, months before the disappearance, receiving explanations that had, at the time, seemed reasonable enough to postpone a formal audit, explanations I now understood had likely been carefully constructed to buy Thomas exactly the additional time he needed to finish preparing his escape. The forensic accountants continued investigation, working through Thomas's complete financial records with subpoena power once the FBI's suspicions solidified, traced the diverted funds through a series of offshore accounts, ultimately identifying a substantial sum, several $1 million, transferred over the preceding 18 months into accounts held in a country with notably limited financial disclosure cooperation with American authorities. The forensic accountant explained to Agent Reyes's team, in a summary I later reviewed myself, that Thomas had structured these transfers carefully, moving funds through several intermediate accounts before their final destination, a layering technique specifically designed to obscure the money's actual origin from any casual or preliminary financial review, though not sophisticated enough, ultimately, to withstand the kind of determined, well-resourced federal investigation his own staged disappearance had inadvertently triggered. I want to describe the specific, growing horror I felt learning about these financial details, understanding that they suggested something considerably darker than the genuine kidnapping I'd spent over a week desperately fearing. Agent Reyes explained to me directly, in a conversation I remember with total, painful clarity, that her team's working theory had shifted considerably, that Thomas's disappearance increasingly appeared to be self-orchestrated, timed specifically to escape both the imminent company audit and whatever criminal charges would likely follow its findings. I asked her, at that point, the question that had been building in me for days without my fully allowing myself to consciously form it, whether she believed Thomas might still be alive, deliberately hiding, rather than genuinely a kidnapping victim at all. She told me, carefully, that her team couldn't yet confirm that theory definitively, but that the financial evidence increasingly pointed in exactly that direction. I remember the specific, disorienting quality of that conversation, sitting in my own kitchen, being asked to consider that the husband I'd spent over a week mourning as a possible murder victim might, in fact, be alive and well, having simply chosen to abandon our entire family rather than face consequences of his own making. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel at that point, not relief, exactly, but a strange, disorienting anger arriving even before I had full confirmation, my own mind already beginning to process a betrayal I hadn't yet been given complete evidence to fully justify. I want to describe, in more specific detail, exactly how substantial the embezzlement had actually been, because understanding the real financial scope mattered considerably to how I eventually processed the full weight of what Thomas had done to his own family's business. The forensic accountant's complete analysis, once finalized, established that Thomas had diverted just over $4 million from the company across nearly 4 years, funds that represented not just abstract corporate revenue, but real money that would otherwise have gone toward employee salaries, equipment investments, and profit distributions to the extended family members who held ownership stakes in the business alongside him. I remember sitting with that specific figure for a long time, understanding that Thomas hadn't simply harmed me and our children through his eventual disappearance. He had, for years before any of this happened, been quietly stealing from his own relatives, people who trusted him as the inheritor of his father's legacy business. The FBI's continued investigation, cross-referencing Thomas's passport records against the offshore account activity, revealed a pattern that finally, completely confirmed what had, by that point, become the team's primary working theory. Records showed Thomas had made several previously undisclosed international trips over the preceding 18 months. Each one coinciding closely with additional transfers into the offshore accounts, trips he described to me, at the time, as ordinary domestic business travel to construction sites in other states. I remember, once Agent Reyes shared this specific detail with me, going back through my own memory of that 18-month period, trying to recall the specific trips Thomas had described, the particular construction sites he'd claimed to be visiting in states I now understood he'd never actually traveled to at all. I remembered him describing, in what felt at the time like ordinary, mildly tedious detail, specific challenges with a project in a neighboring state, conversations I'd listened to with genuine, if distracted, interest, never once suspecting that the entire narrative was fabricated to explain an international trip happening simultaneously, thousands of miles from wherever he claimed to actually be. I remember the specific, sickening clarity of understanding that Thomas had been quietly, methodically building an entirely separate life abroad for well over a year, using business trips I'd had no reason to question as cover for international travel I'd had no idea was actually happening. Agent Reyes's team also identified, through careful review of hotel and rental property records in the specific country the offshore funds had been transferred to, a residential property Thomas had apparently been leasing for several months under a name that wasn't his own, a detail that suggested he'd already begun establishing the practical infrastructure of an entirely new identity well before his staged disappearance ever occurred. I remember Agent Reyes walking me through exactly how thoroughly Thomas had prepared this new identity, a level of detail that genuinely unsettled me even after everything else I'd already learned. He'd apparently obtained documentation under an assumed name through channels investigators were still working to fully trace, established a local bank account tied to that same identity, and had, according to neighbors investigators eventually interviewed, presented himself in his new community as a divorced businessman starting fresh after a difficult marriage, a description that used real, painful details from our actual life together, repurposed into a false narrative designed specifically to explain his presence without raising unnecessary questions. I want to address directly the woman Thomas had apparently been building this new life with, since I understand this is a detail many people will be genuinely curious about, and since her existence added its own specific, devastating layer to everything else I was already processing. Agent Reyes's team identified a woman, a foreign national roughly a decade younger than Thomas, whose own social media presence, once investigators began examining it carefully, showed a developing relationship with Thomas spanning nearly the same 18-month period as his undisclosed international travel, photographs showing the two of them together at locations matching several of his supposedly domestic business trips. I learned, through this same investigation, that this woman appeared to have no knowledge of Thomas's actual marital status or his embezzlement scheme, believing, based on messages investigators eventually reviewed as part of the broader case, that Thomas was a divorced businessman relocating internationally for a legitimate career opportunity. I want to describe the specific, complicated feeling of learning this detail, a strange, unexpected point of shared victimhood with a woman I'd never met, someone who had also, in her own way, been deceived by the same man across the same sustained period of calculated dishonesty. I made the decision, once the full legal proceedings had concluded, to reach out to her directly, a decision my own attorney cautioned me to consider carefully given the complicated circumstances, but one I ultimately felt was the right choice. For my own sense of closure. Our conversation, conducted through a translator given the language barrier between us, was brief but genuinely meaningful, both of us confirming for each other the specific details of Thomas's parallel deceptions, comparing timelines and understanding, together, exactly how methodically he had managed two entirely separate relationships across the same period. She told me she'd since ended all contact with him, understanding, once the truth emerged, that everything she believed about their relationship had been built on a foundation of lies considerably more serious than she could ever have imagined. Thomas was ultimately located and arrested roughly 6 weeks after his staged disappearance, apprehended by local authorities in the country he'd relocated to, working in careful coordination with the FBI once his actual location had been definitively established through the combined financial and travel record investigation. I learned about his arrest through a call from Agent Reyes, a conversation I remember with a strange, disorienting mixture of relief and fresh, specific fury. Relief that the genuine terror of believing him kidnapped and possibly dead was finally, completely resolved, layered immediately against the fresh, cold understanding that he had spent 11 days allowing me to believe I might be planning his funeral, entirely to protect his own escape from consequences he'd brought entirely on himself. I remember exactly where I was standing when that call came through, in our kitchen, the same room where I'd first found that ransom note weeks earlier. Agent Reyes's voice carried a specific, careful professionalism I recognized from our many previous conversations, but I could hear, underneath it, her own genuine relief at finally being able to deliver news that resolved a case her entire team had spent weeks working around the clock to unravel. She told me Thomas had been apprehended without incident, cooperating once. Local authorities confirmed his identity, offering no resistance to the arrest itself, a detail that struck me, in that moment, as almost insultingly calm compared to the 11 days of genuine terror his staged disappearance had put our entire family through. Thomas was extradited back to the United States over the following several weeks, a process complicated by the specific extradition treaty details between the two countries, ultimately returning to face both the original embezzlement charges the company audit would have uncovered regardless, and an entirely new set of charges specifically related to staging his own kidnapping, filing a false police report, obstruction of justice given the substantial law enforcement resources devoted to investigating a crime that had never actually occurred, and additional federal charges related to the interstate ransom demand itself, which, even though never actually collected, constituted its own separate, serious offense. That I want to describe the specific, surreal experience of finally speaking with Thomas directly, once he was back in the United States and formally facing charges. A conversation that occurred through a scheduled legal visit, with my own attorney present given the complexity of the criminal proceedings already underway. I asked him, directly, how he could have allowed me to believe, for 11 full days, that he was being tortured or possibly already dead. He offered, initially, a halting explanation about panic, about feeling trapped by the imminent audit with no other visible way out, a rationalization I found myself unable to accept given the clear, sustained planning Agent Reyes's investigation had already documented, 18 months of careful preparation, not a single, desperate, impulsive decision. I remember watching his face very closely during that initial, halting explanation, looking for some genuine sign of remorse rather than simply strategic damage control given his own current legal circumstances. I found myself unable to fully determine, even sitting directly across from him, how much of what I was witnessing represented authentic feeling and how much represented a practiced, careful performance, a specific uncertainty that has stayed with me since, understanding that I may never fully trust my own ability to read genuine emotion from this particular man again, given everything I now understood him to be capable of convincingly performing. I asked him, too, about the specific, deliberate cruelty of the staged kidnapping itself, rather than simply disappearing without the elaborate fabrication of violence and ransom. He told me, with what I understood as genuine, if entirely inadequate, honesty, that he'd believed a straightforward disappearance would trigger a far more immediate, thorough investigation into his actual whereabouts, while a staged kidnapping would direct law enforcement's initial energy towards searching for kidnappers rather than searching for him directly, buying him critical additional time to fully establish his new identity abroad before anyone began seriously questioning whether he might have orchestrated his own disappearance. I remember pressing him further on this specific reasoning, pointing out that his calculation had required, as its essential foundation, my own genuine, devastating belief that he was being tortured or killed, a belief he had needed to be as convincing and complete as possible for his own plan to actually succeed. I asked him whether he understood that the effectiveness of his own escape had depended entirely on the depth of my suffering, whether a more genuine, less convincing performance of terror on my part would have actually undermined his own carefully plan. He was quiet for a long moment before acknowledging, quietly, that yes, he had understood that specific, uncomfortable calculation clearly, even as he'd proceeded with the plan regardless. I sat with that specific answer for a long time afterward, understanding that Thomas had made a calculated, careful decision to weaponize my own genuine terror and grief as a strategic tool, specifically designed to protect his own escape, a realization that transformed my understanding of the entire 11 days from a shared, terrible ordeal into something considerably colder. A deliberate manipulation I had never once suspected while I was living inside it. I asked him one final question during that visit, one I hadn't fully planned to ask but that emerged almost involuntarily once his explanation had run its course. I asked whether he had felt anything at all, during those 11 days, knowing the specific terror he'd manufactured in me and in our children. He was quiet for a long moment before telling me that he had, genuinely, felt guilt throughout, but that he'd made a deliberate decision to compartmentalize that guilt, understanding it as a necessary cost of the escape he'd already committed to executing. I found that answer, delivered with a kind of clinical, rehearsed composure, somehow more disturbing than if he'd simply claimed to feel nothing at all. The criminal proceedings that followed unfolded across several distinct, serious tracks, reflecting the genuine severity and multi-layered nature of what Thomas had actually done. Thomas ultimately entered a plea agreement addressing both the original embezzlement charges and the separate charges related to the staged kidnapping itself, resulting in a substantial combined sentence reflecting the seriousness of both offenses. My attorney explained that federal prosecutors had initially considered pursuing the maximum available charges on every count, given the sheer scope of both the financial crimes and the elaborate, sustained nature of the staged kidnapping, but had ultimately agreed to a negotiated plea once Thomas's cooperation in helping investigators trace the full scope of the offshore accounts proved genuinely valuable to the broader financial recovery effort. My attorney walked me through the specific reasoning behind the negotiated plea agreement, explaining that while the evidence against Thomas was genuinely overwhelming across both sets of charges, a plea agreement provided certain practical advantages over a full trial, including a faster resolution and the avoidance of forcing our children to potentially testify or otherwise become directly involved in lengthy, public criminal proceedings. I found myself, weighing this decision alongside my attorney, prioritizing our children's well-being over any personal desire I might have felt for the more dramatic, public accountability a full trial might have provided. My attorney explained that the staged kidnapping charges alone carried significant weight, given the substantial law enforcement resources the FBI had devoted to the initial investigation, resources that could have been directed toward genuine, active cases had they not been consumed by an elaborately staged crime that had never actually occurred. The offshore accounts, once formally identified and subject to the appropriate legal processes, were largely recovered and returned to the construction company for restitution to the business Thomas's embezzlement had directly harmed. Though my own attorney explained that full recovery of every diverted dollar remained genuinely uncertain given the complexity of the international financial structures Thomas had constructed to hide the funds. My attorney walked me through the specific, considerable challenges involved in that international asset recovery process, explaining that the country where Thomas had established his new accounts maintained banking privacy laws that, while eventually cooperative given the criminal nature of the case, still required considerable diplomatic and legal coordination between American and foreign authorities before any actual funds could be formally recovered and returned. That process, she told me, would likely continue for many additional months beyond the resolution of Thomas's own criminal case, a timeline that meant the company's own financial recovery would remain an ongoing, unresolved thread for the extended family long after Thomas himself had been formally sentenced. I want to describe, briefly, the specific experience of attending Thomas's formal sentencing hearing, a decision I deliberated over carefully beforehand, ultimately choosing to be present rather than simply learning the outcome secondhand. I remember the federal judge's own remarks during that hearing, addressing directly the specific, calculated cruelty of the staged kidnapping itself, noting for the record the substantial law enforcement resources devoted to the initial investigation and the genuine, documented psychological harm inflicted on Thomas's own family through 11 days of manufactured terror. Hearing a federal judge formally, publicly characterize what had happened to us in those specific terms provided a particular kind of validation I hadn't fully anticipated needing, a formal acknowledgement that the 11 days of genuine terror I'd lived through weren't simply my own overreaction to an eventual embezzlement charge, but a distinct, serious harm the legal system itself recognized and formally addressed. Our children did not attend that hearing, a decision I made carefully with guidance from our family therapist, understanding that witnessing their father's formal sentencing in person might prove considerably more traumatic than the already difficult process of processing everything through age-appropriate conversations at home. That I want to address directly what happened to our marriage and, more importantly, to our 2 teenagers throughout this entire, devastating ordeal. I filed for divorce almost immediately once Thomas's actual situation became clear, a decision that required its own separate, complicated legal navigation given the ongoing criminal proceedings and the substantial financial complications created by the embezzlement and its recovery process. I remember signing those initial divorce papers with a strange, disconnected calm, understanding that this particular decision, unlike almost everything else I'd navigated over the preceding weeks, was entirely within my own control, a small but meaningful reclaiming of agency after weeks spent reacting to circumstances Thomas alone had orchestrated. I want to be honest that explaining this entire situation to our children was, in many ways, considerably more difficult than processing my own devastation directly, requiring careful, age-appropriate honesty about a situation so genuinely extraordinary that even adult professionals I consulted for guidance described it as unusually complex to navigate with teenagers. My older child, 17 at the time, expressed a specific, intense anger that took considerable time and family therapy to work through, focused particularly on the 11 days we'd all genuinely believed his father might be dying, understanding, once the truth emerged, that this genuine terror had been entirely, deliberately manufactured. My younger child processed the situation differently, retreating into a more withdrawn, quiet grief that our family therapist helped me understand as its own valid, if less immediately visible, response to an almost incomprehensible betrayal. I remember one specific conversation with my son, roughly 4 months into our family's ongoing therapy process, where he asked me directly whether he should still consider himself to have a father at all, given everything that had happened. I didn't have a clean, simple answer for that question, and I told him honestly that I didn't, that this was a question he would likely need to work through over considerable time, at his own pace, rather than something either of us could resolve definitively in a single conversation. Our family therapist has helped both children understand that their own eventual relationship with Thomas, whatever shape it takes as they grow older, remains entirely their own choice to navigate, separate from my own decision to end our marriage and separate from any anger I continue to carry myself that I want to describe, briefly, the specific, layered process of explaining this entire situation to the wider circle of family and friends who had spent 11 days genuinely mourning alongside me, believing Thomas a kidnapping victim, before eventually learning the actual, devastating truth. Many of them had taken time off work, organized meal deliveries, sat with me through sleepless nights during those original 11 days, genuine, generous support offered in service of a crisis that had never actually existed in the form they understood it. I found myself, once the truth emerged, needing to have essentially the same difficult, disorienting conversation dozens of times, watching each person move through their own version of the same shock and reassessment I had already worked through myself, a specific, exhausting repetition that added its own layer of difficulty to an already overwhelming period. Several friends admitted, once the truth came out, to their own retrospective unease about small details from those original 11 days that had struck them as slightly off at the time, details they dismissed as simply the chaos and confusion of a genuine crisis rather than any real cause for suspicion. Hearing those retrospective observations helped me understand that I hadn't been uniquely foolish or inattentive during those 11 days. Nobody around me, genuinely caring and attentive as they were, had any real reason to suspect the elaborate deception we were all, together, living inside. That I don't tell this story to suggest that everyone facing genuine desperation or financial crisis is capable of anything resembling what Thomas did. Most people, even facing serious, mounting consequences for their own poor decisions, don't respond by staging an elaborate fake kidnapping and allowing their own family to believe they might be dying. What Thomas did was the result of one specific person's calculated, sustained decision to weaponize the people who loved him most, using my own genuine terror and grief as a deliberate strategic tool to protect his own escape. If there's something practical I'd ask you to take from this, it's simply an awareness that financial secrecy within a marriage, however normal it might feel in the moment, deserves periodic, honest verification. I had no meaningful, independent visibility into Thomas's business finances throughout our entire marriage, trusting him completely with that entire domain of our shared life. I don't know that more active financial involvement on my own part would have caught his embezzlement before it escalated this far, but I've since learned to maintain considerably more independent understanding of my own financial life than I ever had reason to before this entire ordeal. I now review our joint and individual financial accounts personally, monthly, a habit I've maintained consistently since this entire ordeal concluded, understanding that genuine partnership in a marriage doesn't require surrendering all independent financial awareness, regardless of how much trust exists between two people. I think, often, about those 11 days, genuinely believing I might be planning my husband's funeral, sitting with FBI agents in my own living room, terrified in a way I don't think I'll ever fully stop carrying some residual trace of. I got a legal resolution. I got Thomas held formally accountable for both the embezzlement and the staged kidnapping itself. What I can't fully get back is the specific, visceral terror of those 11 days, weaponized deliberately by someone who understood exactly how deeply I would grieve him, and chose to exploit that grief anyway, entirely for his own benefit. I've thought, too, about the specific, strange asymmetry between the 11 days I lived through in genuine terror and the calm, deliberate composure Thomas apparently maintained throughout that same period, sipping coffee on a balcony overlooking the Mediterranean while I sat in my own living room believing him tortured or dead. Understanding that this asymmetry was entirely the point, entirely by design, is something I don't think I'll ever fully stop sitting with, a specific, cold cruelty layered on top of every other form of harm his embezzlement and abandonment had already caused. If this story affected you, or if you've ever discovered that your own genuine grief or terror had been deliberately manufactured by someone you trusted completely, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what I've learned rebuilding my own life and my children's sense of safety, every day.